Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. So it's been a while since I've done a case study on this particular YouTube channel, and I don't mean to use that word lightly. I know a lot of you that went to college, you have advanced degrees, you probably hate hearing the term case study because it means you're going to listen to a boring story and attempt to learn something from it. I know in business school we used to do case study after case study after case study, and they all put me to sleep. Most of them, not all, were quite boring. I am trying to make this one a little bit exciting though. So today we're going to talk about Andy Warhol, cookie jars, and speculation mania. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. So we're going to get in our DeLorean time machine. We're going to go back to the year 1987. And if you wonder why we're going back to the year 1987, it's because one of my favorite contemporary artists and pretty much a pop culture icon died in that year. Andy Warhol is probably one of the most famous pop culture-based artists ever known. If you Google his name, if you come across some of his work, even if you Google Andy Warhol art in a Google search engine, you'll see what I mean. You've probably already been exposed to his art. You just don't realize it if you don't know who Andy Warhol was. Andy Warhol pretty much came to dominance in the 1960s, the 1970s, even in the 1980s. He pretty much was part of the MTV era, that generation of artists like Duran Duran, David Bowie, Grace Jones. He hung out with all those people. He was very well known. He even was featured, here's a little bit of a history tidbit for some of you guys, an Easter egg if you will. He was actually featured in a Commodore Amiga commercial, believe it or not. Andy Warhol was so well known at the time. Andy Warhol collected a lot of categories in the antiques and collectibles trade. In fact, when he died in 1987, when his next of kin or his heirs went to clear out his house, they realized that, oh my gosh, Andy Warhol just might be a hoarder, because his house in Manhattan was very well maintained, but he had literally 3 or 4 floors stacked to the ceiling of different antique and collecting categories. Well, one collection that he had that he pretty much cherished wasn't really that much valuable per se in financial terms, but it meant a lot to him. He collected vintage and antique cookie jars. Now, a lot of these cookie jars came on the market back in the 1930s and 1940s from manufacturers like the name of McCoy Pottery and the like. They would sell for $2.99 back in the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, if you want to do something interesting right now, log on to eBay and just search McCoy, M-C-C-O-Y, cookie jar, and you'll see all these different types of cookie jars. Now, if you search sold listings, you'll see how this tale ends, ironically. Well, Andy Warhol had 175 of these cookie jars. He had other collections that were really impressive as well. He collected Bakelite, other particular historical artifacts as well. But the one collection that he really liked, because he really didn't spend too much on these items, was his cookie jar collection. Now, there was 175 cookie jars that he would go to antique marts, he would go to flea markets and the like, and he would buy one here or there and put it in his collection. Well, ironically, in the early 1980s, there was a major collecting boom in a lot of these items that were produced in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. At this particular time, you had Hummels shooting up in value. You had a lot of esoteric collector plates and other items coming onto the market that were capturing consumers' dollars at this particular time. Also, you have to understand, in the 1980s, there was no internet. This is the pre-internet era. So even though a lot of people think, and I agree with this assessment, that the antiques and collectibles trade is extremely fragmented today in the year 2020, imagine how fragmented it was back in the 1980s, prior to the internet era. If you wanted to know the value of something, you pretty much had to trust, I hate to say it, a price guide, or you had to attend auctions regularly, or you had to have a personal relationship with dealers in the business. Now, this was during the time where antique shows, antique markets were pretty much going strong across the United States and even in Europe. We can also include that in there too, because Europe was prominently participating in the antiques boom that occurred in the 1980s and to a lesser extent the 1990s that happened after Reagan passed his tax cuts that pretty much, I'm going to say it guys, favored the wealthy. The wealthy put that money into art, high-end antiques, and the like. Well, ironically, the antiques market went through a massive speculator boom in the 1980s and 90s. But unfortunately, as you're going to see as the story unfolds, most people bought the wrong items for long-term growth. So when we look at cookie jars, what happened was Andy Warhol, after his death, his heirs went in, they cleaned out his house, and they contacted Sotheby's auction. Now there's something you got to understand before we go any further in this story about an auction house like Sotheby's. Sotheby's is a high-end auction house in the antiques and collectibles trade. They cater to extremely wealthy clients. So if somebody else wanted to consign a collection of cookie jars that at the time only had a value of $100 to $200 a piece, it doesn't matter that you have 175 of them, Sotheby's would most likely turn you down and say, I'm sorry, it isn't in our best interest to offer this collection at present time at auction because the value just isn't there. Well, Sotheby's knew that because these cookie jars belonged to Andy Warhol, they would fetch a higher price on the secondary market. Now, ironically, here's the kicker. When Sotheby's added up the value of the collection, they said, you know what? We anticipate, without all things being considered, this collection's only going to go for $7,000 or $8,000. But we're willing to take a risk on it because it belonged to Andy Warhol, who was pretty much an icon of that particular era. So the auction goes to bid, and this 175 cookie jar collection that has a value on the secondary market at that time of $100 to $200 a jar, what do you think the auction ends at for when you add up all the final sale prices of these items? Almost $250,000. Sotheby's is left stunned. They expected at best those particular items on a good day would go for $21,000 for everything. They got $250,000. Now, when the sale prices were released, the general public out there pretty much said, oh my gosh, cookie jars are where this is at. So now, your average dealer out there that deals in antiques and collectibles, he's starting to get calls, hey, do you have any cookie jars in stock from the 1930s or 40s? I would like to buy them. Well, this sets off a massive speculative boom in this particular market. By 1991, cookie jars that could be had for $100 to $200 a piece just 5 years before were selling for thousands of dollars, guys. Now, a lot of people in the trade, dealers particularly, knew that the reason why this collection of cookie jars went for so much was because it belonged to Andy Warhol. That was the secret ingredient that a lot of the Timmys and the Poindexters of that era didn't seem to understand. So a lot of people were pouring massive amounts of money into these cookie jars. Well, you can guess what happened next. The cookie jars went up exponentially in value and shot up in value so fast, there was no one left to sell these items to at those increased prices because everybody who was in the inside of the trade looking at these prices said, you know what? These cookie jars, the prices they're going for is insane. There's no way I am paying $2,000 for a cookie jar when 5 years ago I could have got the same cookie jar for $100 or $200 on the market. Something's amiss here. People are acting on these auction results, not realizing that the only reason these items have value is because they belong to Andy Warhol. I've said this before. The average person out there cannot afford to spend $500,000, $1 million, $2 million on a painting or a piece of art. So if you're a fan of Andy Warhol and you want a way to connect with him as a living human being or the artist that he was, the easiest way to do it is to buy something that he owned. Well, people were willing to pay a premium for these objects because they belonged to Andy Warhol, and the auction company at the time, Sotheby's, would give you either a bill of sale or a certificate of authenticity stating that this item belonged in the collection of Andy Warhol. So that way you can connect to the artist without having to remortgage your house or take out a massive loan to attempt to buy a $500,000 painting that belonged to him. Well, ironically, a lot of the average people who were entering the antiques trade back in the 1980s didn't understand how the market works. It's just like today. We have mass levels of speculative hysteria going on in a lot of pop culture-based collecting categories. And no matter how many videos I create for YouTube, no matter how many articles I write for Antiques and Auction News, there's always somebody there telling me, Sean, you're wrong. This is the next big thing. We can go all the way back to the 1990s when I was pretty much active in the trade full time at that point. Or when we talk about Pez dispensers, Atari games, Beanie Babies, Power of the Force 2 Star Wars figures, whatever it was, somebody was there to tell me, Sean, you're wrong. This is the next big thing. Well, ironically, all those collecting categories that I just mentioned are down 40 to 70% as of present time. So if you would have put money into those collecting categories, you would not only not be ahead, you would not only not be able to get your money back, but you would have lost 40 to 70% on top of that. So if that's your idea of an investment, I wish you all the best. Because as these people who went after these cookie jars learned in the early to mid 1990s, that cookie jars only have value based on what somebody's willing to pay for them on the secondary market. And once that mania ends, what do you think happened to the value of these cookie jars? A lot of you are going to answer wrong because a lot of you are going to tell me, well, they went back down to $100 to $200. Well, go look on eBay. Here's your homework assignment for this case study. Go look on eBay and just search completed auctions for McCoy cookie jars and see how many are selling for under $50 or under $100 today in 2020. Be very careful getting involved in speculative markets if you are attempting to gauge the market or invest long term. I can tell you right now, I know a lot of people back in the 1990s that got burnt bad when I was in high school by investing and collecting in these cookie jars, thinking that they were the next big thing. And before you laugh at those people, because even back then, I didn't laugh at those people. I didn't know maybe it could be the next big thing. But you got to analyze, guys. Everything's relative. For the people that come on my channel and claim, no, Sean, collectible video games are going to be the next big thing, you don't understand. I agree with you. Collectible video games are accelerating in price, but that should give you pause. It should not cause you to take action unless if you own those items and you want to consign them. It's the same thing with what's happening in Pokemon and what has just transpired in Magic the Gathering. There's a lot of people contacting me saying, hey man, I bought all these reserve list Magic the Gathering cards that are now down 40, 50, 60, in some cases 70%. What do I do? And I tell them it's quite simple. You're pretty much forced to hold these items until the market rebounds. Some of these markets will rebound. Cookie jars is not one of those markets. So I hope that you've learned something from this video, or at least opened your eyes to how speculative bubbles have been happening in the antiques and collectibles trade for decades now. The real sophisticated investors out there understand this. They learn to adapt to trends, and they also know what to look for to identify these markets. And most of them, I'm going to be 100% honest, stay clear of these markets. For instance, you can go online and you can Google the speculative bubble that happened in coins when third-party grading premiered. There were a lot of prominent coin collectors that exited the market and took a wait-and-see attitude back in the 1980s. Today, they're back in that market collecting again. But back in the 1980s, the market became so overheated, they recognized that a lot of these items were selling at a price level that was not sustainable. So they pulled back. That's what smart money does. Smart money does not throw money after bad items that are selling for a premium. It doesn't happen. Smart money takes the long game in. It looks at these items and it doesn't get caught up in FOMO, fear of missing out. It realizes that a lot of these markets are nothing more than fugazi that is benefiting the top few players in those particular collecting categories. Learn from this, guys. Analyze markets. Look back. Even if you go back to the 1990s or 70s, there's a lot of speculative bubbles that you can learn from. I will cover them on this channel. Thanks for watching. I thank you for all your comments, your feedback, subscribing to these videos. Even if you leave a comment that I don't necessarily agree with, I thank you for your support and the time that you put into watching these videos and commenting on them. Have a good night.